So Bukata Hayes, originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So came to Mankato in 1994. But in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, grew up in the inner city, in the projects, so the Berryland projects off of Sherman Boulevard and Forest Avenue, right? And so my mom raised four boys all by herself. And so for me, my image of strength, in particular black strength, is a black woman, right? And so she was strong enough to keep us out of trouble, to make sure we went in the right direction. Her and my dad never married, and so for me, not having a father in the home, right, wasn't the typical, he didn't have anything to do with us. It was just simply he wasn't there. My father was a black freedom fighter, was in the struggle. So that's how I got my name. So a little bit about my name. So my full name is Bukata Onaje Dabi. Last name is Hayes. So, and so my father gave his kids African names to reconnect us to heritage, because as descendants of slaves, we don't have a geographic place we can pinpoint on the continent. And so naming for many freedom fighters, kind of black liberation fighters, was a way of reconnecting us to heritage ideologically. Right? And so the naming was that. So there's a funny story about that. So my father's name is Dia Damani. It means thoughtful champion. My brother's name is Adigun Momar, more of an Arabic African name. His name means great and righteous philosopher. And then there's me, Bukata Onaje Dabi. My name means second son resembles the first. That's it, right? So, I mean, for me, that name meant a lot, in particular in classrooms where in the early 80s, a teacher, right, would say Sally and John, even Tyrone or Rashida, but then she got to Bukata. I got really good at knowing where my name came up in roll call, right, to give the teacher a little bit of a break, right? And so I've carried that with me throughout my life. I believe it provides me difference. It further kind of makes me stand out within a crowd, but it also, I think, is something to live up to, right? To make sure that I'm living up to that heritage that this name was given to me for. The part of my story that helped shape or mold me as a black person was, one, my name, but it also was kind of my upbringing. So mom and dad, while didn't marry, were together. Dad left to go to kind of continue to struggle in other parts, but my mom, right? So my mom raising four boys all by herself. Kind of that piece of my upbringing has allowed me to, one, understand what strength really looks like, how it behaves, and ultimately how I'm able to take, I believe, leadership from a black woman, right? Like as a growing boy, you had to be able to, I had to be able to, my brothers had to be able to follow the lead of a black woman. And so for me, that has really shaped what I carry into my life today in terms of partnering and looking and being able to follow a woman's lead. And then also protection, right? So me and my my three brothers, we understood like we had to protect mom, right? So right from the beginning, there was this element of making sure she was okay, even though, you know, she was good and she could handle herself, but making sure she was okay. And so I think that part of my upbringing has definitely shaped my outlook today, right? I want to be someone who's welcoming and inclusive. I want to be someone who uplifts others. And a lot of that comes from my mom's example in the home, and then my father's example of fighting for the rights of black folks in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and across the country. And ultimately, his commitment to that had him leave his family, right? So there's a whole lot of stuff packed into there, but like he was so committed to liberating all black folks that he understood it even meant he had to sacrifice for him, right? A normal life and like this settled down life and a family. So those things stick with me today, make me the father who I am, makes me the community member I am. Came to Mankato in 1994 and really came to Mankato because I had an opportunity to play basketball. So for me, my senior year, I'm playing basketball, and unfortunately, this is, at the time, it probably still is, a really common thing for young black folks, and that was, where are you going to college? And for me, my answer was, I'm not, right? I'm gonna go find a job and do what I can to help family. And my high school coach at the time, a white gentleman named Win Parkinson, said, hey man, I think I got a place where you can go. I know a coach. that coaches basketball. I think you'd be really good. So he introduced me to Art Westfall. Art Westfall was the basketball coach at Bethany Lutheran College here in Mankato. So I came to Mankato to play basketball, which I think the overarching theme that I take out of that is like we should stop telling young folks, in particular black folks, young black folks, like why they should go to school. Because I think anybody would have told me I had the wrong reason for going to school, because I just wanted to go play basketball, right? But that took me out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, brought me to Mankato, has presented me with the life that I have right now, and so it was the right choice, right? And so I think that's how I came to Mankato. Spent 2 years there. It was a transfer institution. Finished up in Duluth, Minnesota, at the College of St. Scholastica, and then came back to Mankato in late 1999. And so I've been here ever since, right? Doing kind of community work, helping our community move forward. Married, my wife is white, so I have 4 mixed race, biracial kids, 3 boys, and then a baby girl. And so the baby girl gets whatever she wants. I just always say that, right? But I also know that as black men and black women, which my kids are considered in this country, right? That it is important that they understand who they are, right? And so kind of leaning back on who my dad was, leaning back on who my mom was, and they have a great relationship with their grandparents, my parents. It's important for me to make sure that they know what being black is, what that entails. Yes, we've had the conversation about what happens when you drive at a 20-year-old, a 15-year-old, a 14-year-old, and a 9-year-old, and all of them understand what happens when we get pulled over and why dad acts a certain way, right? And I think the important piece is that, like, because my wife is white, she has 4 other sisters who all married white men, and those families don't have to have that conversation, right? And matter of fact, they're pretty open about it, saying, hey, like, we don't have to have that conversation. Like, we don't even know what it is, right? And so I carry all that stuff coming from a predominantly black community in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, living in a predominantly white community in Mankato, Minnesota, as I carry all those things with me to infuse my kids, kind of fill them up, because I know that they're going to go out into a world that doesn't see them as whole and equal in value, fill them up so that they can come back to me each night. You know what I mean? Which I think ultimately in the world that we are in, I mean, as black parents, like we just want our kids to come home, right? And I think we do whatever we have to. Like, I do whatever I have to make sure you come home. Yes, I know there's injustice, and yes, we will fight for that. But you have to be here, right, to be able to fight for that. And so I think like that experience, right, that background of who I am has helped me tremendously in kind of leading my family right now. So again, because all of my and this can kind of probably go to being black in America, right? So shortly after Trayvon Martin, right, I remember having a conversation with family, right? And this is my sister's, my wife's sister's brother-in-laws. So we're at the table, and I'm talking with one of my brother-in-laws, and we're just talking about like, you know, what our kids have to do. And I remember talking to my brother-in-law, and I'm saying, hey, like talking to my son, you know, say, hey man, make sure you have your hood down when you go into the store. Like just make sure, man. What now? And so we got into this big long conversation about, well, why would you tell him that? Like you're setting him up for, like you're presenting this false pretense to him that is making him like be distrustful or this in that situation, right? And I'm saying, no, man, like I have to do that because he's seen differently when he walks out, right? He's seen as a threat, right? And so I have to do whatever I can. I have to inform him and like work with him so that he understands and he's cognizant of that as he walks into space. So we're having this conversation about, you shouldn't be telling her. I'm like, I have to. When he gets pulled over, I have to. And so I just remember one of the brother-in-laws, who me and him have had a relationship for almost 20 years now, right? And I remember him in that situation, just sitting, like listening. And then he finally said, so this is a white guy from the Clearbrook, Aiken area in Minnesota. He's sitting there listening. The newest brother-in-law is from the South. And he simply looks and he says, hey, look, man, talking to like the group. He says, look, like, I can't tell you why it's different for Boo and his son, but it is, man. Like I don't even know if I completely agree, but I'm just telling you, like, it is different for him and his son as compared to me and my son, right? And this idea of like how we all connect to it, right? Like, that's my brother-in-law. We've been working together for 20 years, right? Having very different views, but the idea of experience and him just saying like it's just different, right? I think speaks to kind of where we need, how much farther we have to go and where we need to get to when we talk about being Black in America, that folks can simply admit it's different. And we can go through all the interpretations about what that means. But like, if we can't admit there's a difference in experience, like, we can't start, right? And I hope that like where we are right now is that we're going to start to fully admit that there's a difference and start to uncover all the things that make it different. Allyship is important, right? I think it's important for Black folks, right? So I'm saying this to Black folks, is that like we can't do it alone. There are some things we will have to do, and that is we have to become more united. We have to fully understand the long-term goals, right, of equality and equity. Like, we have to do that internally. We have to do some of that work. But we also have to understand that we're in a country of 330 million folks, and we are not a majority, right? That we do have to form these partnerships that allow us to move forward. And we do have some folks in white community that are willing to be our allies, right? That we have to make sure to be open to that. So Malcolm X, right? If you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, one of his regrets is that he had a young white woman travel to see him to ask, what can I do to help in the struggle? And at the time, he dismissed her, didn't say anything. And what he said is like, that was one of his regrets. That, yeah, I should have told her what she could do. I should have told her how she could help. And so even for some in the Black community, what they consider to be almost like a revolutionary figure, understood allyship, understood that like we all, like, if folks want to play a part, how do we have them do that? So what they could do, one is to just do some education, right? So, I mean, it is important in a country as racialized as America that we understand what race, what whiteness is, what anti-Blackness is, right? What being non-racist versus anti-racist is, right? And so I think that first part is what like white America can do. I think the other thing is that white America has to admit that there's a history that that plays into Black folks' psyche that is absolutely justified in mistrusting America, right? Like, if you think about the institution of slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights, and you think about all the things that happened there, right? This era of lynching that followed like our emancipation. If you think about Tulsa and Black Wall Street, if you think about Rosewood, we have so many instances in which we tried to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and we were simply, our communities were burned to the ground. We were strung up in trees. And so I think like white America has to wrestle with that, right? Because that does impact how Black folks want to engage. We don't want to engage with folks who would see that as non-essential, right, in their allyship. We need to understand that, because those things have simply morphed into current day mass incarceration, police killings of Black folks, George Floyd, right? I mean, like, folks talk about that as a modern day lynching. When you look at it, right, that it absolutely was a modern day lynching, right? For 8 minutes and 48 seconds. His breath was taken, right? Derek Chauvin, the officer, I heard it said somewhere that he was kneeling as if he was simply kneeling on concrete and nothing was underneath him, right? I mean, I want you to think about that visual, right? So yes, we're starting to see a resurgence of lynchings, actually, right? I mean, we've seen probably 7 to 8 lynchings in the last month. We've seen a rise of white supremacy, right? 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia. There was a march, a rally, tiki torches, and so I think it's important that that's the work that white allies have to do, is to understand kind of the pervasiveness, the vastness, the broadness, the depth of race and whiteness, and how that has impacted like this country, and most in like the psyche, the mentality, the emotion, the physical beings of Black folks in this country. And I think that's what they can do. And then what follows that is, I talked about earlier, like submitting to a black woman, right, as my mom in leadership, and that she's a symbol of strength for me. And I would say that that's something too that white America has to be willing to do, and that is submit themselves to black leadership and black voice, right? Like that is so critical right now. And I think if white America is unwilling to do that, right, the majority of white America is unwilling to do that, like there's just no way, right? There is just no way that we see the change that we're all working for. And so I would say that's probably the progression, right? This understanding of race and whiteness and anti-blackness, the history that has gone into black folks not trusting and not being willing to partner, and now in this new era, white America being willing to submit themselves, right, to black leadership and black voice and follow, right, becomes really critical. In Mankato from 2016 to 2018, and it was aimed at moving a predominantly white community from being passively non-racist to actively anti-racist, right? And so that 2-year effort was called Right on Race to be Right on Race. It was a community journaling initiative. So we harnessed the power of journaling, right? This reflection, introspection, to really push folks deeper and have them engage more meaningfully. And so through that 2-year effort, we went through the past, present, and future. So we talked about race, right? We kept it on race too, right? Not on culture or other things. We kept it specifically and laser focused on race. So we talked about the past, present, and future. We talked about the social impact. So what is bias and prejudice and microaggressions and racial battle fatigue and like all these sorts of things to kind of bring up this terminology of folks who were engaged. And then we talked about the specific areas in which race has seen has been used, right, to create predictable outcomes, such as education, right, the achievement gap, the discipline gap, housing, right, redlining, right, that substantially cut the feet out from underneath black folks as they were trying to kind of build the American dream that we all were promised. We talked about it in income and in the wealth gap. We talked about it in terms of health, right? That, I mean, even today we're still seeing health, disproportionate health outcomes between black and white via diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, and even to the fact that, like in the most advanced country in the world, like black women are still 3 times more likely to die in childbirth, right? Like how is that even possible, right? And so I think we walked through all of that, and we had about 300 folks engage via online and just emailed out. We sent out prompt topics to prompt folks to journal every 2 weeks. So we had about 360 folks engaged that way. And then we had a cohort of about 100 folks, 80 to 100 folks who showed up for all the harvest sessions when we would come back together, discuss all that material, work through it, and try and grow together. And so over that 2 years, what we found is that one, white Mankatoans or greater Mankatoans, one became more comfortable being uncomfortable about race. They became more confident in saying that, or in knowing that there's a history behind it, right? That is not just that black folks are being, let's say, soft or sensitive or whatever folks might say. And no, like if you just simply walk through the history, right? Just open yourself up to walking through the history and seeing all the ways that the thread of race is like interwoven between our education, our criminal justice, our housing, our economic system, health system, that you'll see that like it's real. And then the courageousness to say that race matters, right? Because I think in a predominantly white community, it would be pretty easy to say race doesn't matter, right? Maybe because of the infrequency of us engaging with folks of color or black folks, or just simply not wanting to be inconvenienced, right? But we found that white folks who were engaged in this effort really started to take that turn from being passively non-racist to actively anti-racist, and they showed up, right? I think that also speaks to why Mankato, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, was very visible, right? Folks were out, folks are committed. And so now what we have to do is understand the long term, right? That we can't simply be engaged in this moment, that, you know, even in a few months there's an election. And do you know about that? And in 6 months or a year, are you at the meetings that continue to move our community and pivot our community towards like this more racially just society becomes important too. So I think all of that speaks to like the process that I believe our white allies have to be willing to go through, right? So there's a really poignant moment when we were in a harvest session and we were talking about housing. And one of the journalers, her dad was a vet, utilized the GI Bill. Her dad was in failing health. And so in the harvest session, we had a deeper dive around redlining. And it was pointed out that the GI Bill, right, was not applied equally, right, upon vets returning, right? That white GIs were able to take advantage of it, but black GIs were not, right? And so it created this wealth inequality. But so she's in there, and her father, again, a vet, took advantage of the GI Bill. He's in failing health. So her and her family are talking about, now what do we do with Dad's house? And in that harvest session, she started to cry. And what she realized was that one of her dad's friends, black GI, like, didn't have that opportunity for his kids to talk about, so what do we do with Dad's house that now we all get some sort of financial benefit from, right? And it became clear to her there, right, that, whoa, wait a minute. It's not just individually how I engage with folks, that there was a system put in play, and if I'm not aware of that system that's in play, I really don't understand what the big issue is about race. Like, my dad was a GI, right? And so I think those are the things that I think our white allies have to be, like, ready to go through, is this really emotional, tough work, right, going forward, to be allies. I ought to say, like, you got to walk through the fire with us, right? Like, I don't believe you seeing the fire coming and knowing that I got to walk through it, right? Because I'm black in America. Like, I don't have a choice not to walk through it. You can't, like, sidestep that, right? Enjoy the privileges of whiteness. And then on the other side, check on me to say, hey, man, how you doing? I don't think that's an ally, right? I think an ally is a person who walks, like, side by side with you through that, right? Because that fire is going to come. Like, if you're black in America, you understand the fire is going to happen. It's going to be at your job. It may be in your schooling. It may be with your kids. It may be with your mom or a family member. But the fire is coming, and that our white allies have to be willing to stand with us, to have our back, right? And I think that's the tough part, because, like, you have to actively give up some things. You have to actively give up anonymity in a community in which you don't have to say what you are for, right? And in particular in smaller communities like ours, that if you do say what you are for, folks see you. They'll see you at the grocery store. They'll see you at church, and you become as isolated at times as black folks in that community. And so I think that's tough, right? Because white allies will have to give up something. And are they really ready to do that? So redlining was this practice, right? And they called it redlining. But so some of the history, if we go back and get context, is that the FDA, or the Federal Housing Authority, for the United States of America, not the FDA, but the FHA, they instituted, like, these markers of good to bad property, right? And so in those markers was some specific areas that spoke to race. So one was, on the original one, is the infiltration of Negroes. You were supposed to put a percentage by that, right? So that was one of those markers that they used to say whether it was a good or bad property. And so what we saw was cities took those Federal Housing Authority kind of guidelines, and then they, like, mapped out their city. Green being great, blue being kind of transitional, red being no. And what you found is that the red areas were mainly folks of color, black folks, and those property values were greatly diminished or divested in. And then the green and the blue properties were mainly white communities, and those properties were heavily invested in. So, and this comes from my sources for Race, the Power of Illusion. It's a documentary series. And in the third volume of that is The House We Live In. And there's a section in there that talks to that. And I forget the exact figures, but billions of dollars were invested in white home ownership, right? And only like 2% of those billions, I'm talking about hundreds of billions of dollars, only 2% of that went to to folks of color, right? And so even when we were building our country, right, building kind of this wealth and housing, redlining came in. So the redlining, right, you literally drew a red line around those properties, and those properties then quickly diminished in value, didn't gain value because of who was there, not because of what the property was, not because of the upkeep in those days, but it was about who was there. So redlining was one of those really, I mean, if you look at our communities today, like redlining, it absolutely kind of constructed what we see in terms of our rural areas versus our urban areas, and then including like suburbs and exurbs, right? Like, because the red areas most times were in inner cities. And so then if you wanted good property value, what'd you do? You moved outside of that red line. And then you had suburbs start, right? And then even as, and we see that changing now, right? Where you're moving more folks of color out to suburbs, and now downtowns are being revitalized, right? But that revitalization is mostly white, right? That is not black. And so redlining was this practice that basically stripped, right, dollars, and stripped monies from black families, right, as they were paying for their homes and other things. And it basically like invested, right, or tripled, doubled investment in white families who were purchasing and financing their homes too. And again, that led, if you think about the connectedness of race in that, so we know we fund schools off of property values. So systemically, if you can continue to redline an area, have those property values be diminished, then what does the school look like in that particular neighborhood versus the neighborhood that has been overly invested in, right? And those schools are going to look different, right? So then you impact it there. And then you take it even further where we know we see achievement gaps. Well, what do the schools look like? And we do know that some states base their third grade reading levels, right, off of the future prison population, right? So it's all these ways in which if we are unwilling to have the real authentic conversation about race, and redlining is just one of the ways. There's many other ways that we can talk about, but redlining is just one of the ways that like we have to be willing to talk about. We got to be honest about it, because I think if we are not, then we really aren't trying to transform a system for all of us. We really are just trying to figure out individually how I can continue a system until it doesn't matter to me anymore, right? So I think the practice of redlining was one of those ways that our country has to reckon with. And I think white allies have to be willing to fight that battle too, right? Understanding that, yes, it may impact my property value, or it may have my neighbors be mad at me, or it may whatever. I think black folks have had to deal with that this entire time, right? If we were the first black person in the neighborhood, maybe our home values are good, but as more black folks joined, we quickly saw white flight, right? And we quickly saw our home values diminish. So, I mean, it's something that black America has been dealing with this entire time. And so if white America is serious about being on our side, serious about being allies, they need to be serious about undoing and dismantling all the systems, right, that have played to their benefit, knowingly or unknowingly. Systemic racism is important, and it's a critical concept because it takes away the notion that I do individual things that uphold racism or that are racist. Systemic racism is the practice of redlining, and how we tie so much to one another in our community. So our home values, right? So that's also tied to, let's say, credit scores. Then those credit scores allow you to get financing at this particular percentage rate, or it doesn't. So I'm paying more to live in my house right away. And then my house isn't valued as high as others, right? Based on what they say is location, but really it's who's in that location, right? So then I'm paying more in my house, have a worse APR, and then my school that my kids go to, right, is financed off of my property. And so if I'm in an inner city like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, right, and home values are $20,000 to $30,000, right? So what kind of school am I getting versus someone in a suburb, let's say, of the Twin Cities or Milwaukee, or Mequon or Greenfield, and their home values are $300,000. And again, if we're funding our nation's students, right, education on housing, right, who's going to get who most likely is going to get the better education? Then that education means, how do I get into college, right? Then what kind of degree do I get that then helps me to get the job, in what community, in what field, right? And so the structural piece of that is, we see race plays a part in the housing, we see race plays a part in the education, we see race plays a part, again, in the criminal justice system, right? Because if folks don't get an education, right, if folks don't learn to read, like we can kind of start to map some of that out, it does mean that they may have a greater frequency of engagement with public safety. And we do know that a greater frequency of engagement will lead to petty things that become major, right? So then the criminal justice system. And then this idea of like what kind of community, right, after I get a degree, right, what kind of a community am I living in, and what kind of system upholds, right, that. And so I think the notion of systemic racism speaks to the many kind of connected sectors of a community, right, that have racism embedded in it, that then, I would say, gives us really predictable outcomes, right? On percentage, you take a Black person in Mankato vis-a-vis a white person in Mankato, and you're probably able to, right, predict like the certain outcomes. And we can do that across the nation. Again, we're not talking about you and me as individuals. We're talking about a system that produces results. I often say it this way, right? So if you look at nursing, there's some systemic things in there that says any nursing class you go into, right, in this country at a college level, it's probably gonna be 95% women and like 5 or less % guys. Like, do we really believe that that's because that's the field that women want to go into? Or do we believe that there's some other factors that produce such a lopsided ratio, right, of engagement? That's a predictable outcome. And we would say, in terms of education, criminal justice, housing, income, health, all of those things would have predictable outcomes between Black folks vis-a-vis white folks in those systems. And it's throughout those systems. And that would be the systemic part.